Imagine walking into a relationship with everything planned. Every step, every word, every touch, because the endgame is simple, money. But what happens when the lines between deception and love blur? What happens when a young man, driven by ambition and desperation, finds himself entangled in the life of a wealthy elderly woman, only to discover that not everything is as it seems? In a story where greed and guilt collide, emotions will run high, and nothing will prepare you for the decisions this young man must make. Will he walk away with the fortune he craves, or will something far deeper change the course of his life forever? The stakes have never been higher, and the price of his choices may cost him more than he ever imagined. What would you do when faced with a decision like this? The crisp autumn air carried the aroma of freshly brewed coffee as Mark nervously adjusted his collar, his eyes fixed on the ornate entrance of the Chateau Élysée, one of New York City's most exclusive cafes. At just 23, Mark looked out of place among the sea of Armani suits and Chanel dresses. His second-hand blazer and scuffed shoes were a stark reminder of why he was here, a desperate attempt to escape the suffocating grip of poverty that had defined his entire life. His heart raced as he spotted her. Ellen Rothschild, 75 years old, widowed, and worth an estimated $500 million. She glided into the cafe with an elegance that belied her age, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, diamonds glinting at her ears and throat. Mark's breath caught in his throat. This was it, his one shot at changing everything. For months, he had meticulously planned this moment. He had studied Ellen's routines, her likes and dislikes, even going so far as to get a job as a barista at her favorite coffee shop just to observe her up close. And now, here she was, unwittingly walking into his carefully laid trap. But as Ellen approached, something unexpected happened. Mark felt a sudden, sickening lurch in his stomach. The reality of what he was about to do hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just some nameless, faceless Mark. This was a real person, someone's mother, someone's friend, someone who had lived a full life, experienced joys and sorrows he couldn't even imagine. For a brief, paralyzing moment, Mark considered abandoning his plan. He could walk away now before he crossed a line he knew he could never uncross. But then the bitter memories flooded back, nights spent hungry, winters without heat, the constant, gnawing shame of being the poorest kid in school. No, he told himself, he had come too far to back out now. Swallowing hard, Mark put on his most charming smile and approached Ellen's table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I couldn't help but notice. Is that a first edition Hemingway you're reading?" Ellen looked up, her blue eyes sharp and assessing behind her designer frames. For a heart-stopping second, Mark feared she would see right through him. But then her face softened into a warm smile. "Why, yes, it is," she replied, her voice rich and cultured. "You have quite an eye, young man." Mark's rehearsed lines flowed easily as he engaged her in conversation about literature, art, and travel, all topics he had painstakingly researched. With each passing minute, he could see Ellen becoming more intrigued, more charmed by this young man who seemed so different from the usual crowd that surrounded her. But as their conversation deepened, Mark found himself genuinely captivated by Ellen's wit and intelligence. She spoke of her late husband with a tenderness that made his chest ache, and shared anecdotes from a life so full of adventure it made his head spin. For brief moments, he almost forgot why he was really there. As their impromptu chat stretched into its second hour, Ellen glanced at her watch with surprise. "My goodness, where has the time gone?" she exclaimed. "I'm afraid I've kept you far too long, Mark." "Not at all," Mark replied quickly, fighting the urge to panic. He couldn't let her leave, not when he was so close. "I've enjoyed every minute." Ellen studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Mark's shock and delight, she said, "Well, since you've been kind enough to keep an old woman company, the least I can do is offer you a ride home. My driver is waiting outside." Mark's heart raced. This was beyond his wildest expectations. "That's incredibly generous of you," he said, hoping his voice didn't betray his excitement. "I'd be honored." As they walked out of the cafe together, Mark felt a dizzying mix of triumph and guilt. He had done it, made first contact, charmed his way into Ellen's good graces. The plan was in motion, but the weight of what he was about to do settled over him like a shroud. In the plush interior of Ellen's town car, surrounded by the scent of leather and her subtle perfume, Mark found himself studying her profile. There was a vulnerability there he hadn't expected, a hint of loneliness behind her confident exterior. For the first time, he wondered if he had seriously underestimated the complexity of what he was getting himself into. As the car wove through the bustling streets of Manhattan, Ellen turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You know, Mark," she said softly, "in my experience, things that seem too good to be true often are." A chill ran down Mark's spine. Did she suspect something? Had he given himself away somehow? But Ellen's next words caught him completely off guard. "But sometimes," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "life surprises you in the most unexpected ways." The car came to a stop in front of Mark's rundown apartment building, a jarring contrast to the luxury he had just experienced. As he stepped out, Ellen caught his hand. "I've enjoyed our talk, Mark," she said. "Perhaps we could do it again sometime?" Mark nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As the car pulled away, he stood on the sidewalk, his mind reeling. He had come into this with a clear plan, a simple con with a big payout. But now, watching Ellen's car disappear into the New York traffic, he realized he had stumbled into something far more complicated and potentially far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. With a deep breath, Mark turned and walked into his building, knowing that his life had just changed irrevocably. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ellen's sprawling Hamptons estate as Mark stepped out of his beat-up Toyota Corolla, a lump forming in his throat. It had been 3 weeks since their chance encounter at the Chateau Élysée, and in that time, he had managed to weave himself deeper into Ellen's life than he ever thought possible. As he approached the grand entrance, Mark couldn't help but feel like an imposter in his carefully curated outfit, a polo shirt and chinos that had cost him nearly a month's rent. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The door swung open, revealing Ellen's radiant smile. "Mark, darling, come in, she exclaimed, pulling him into a warm embrace that sent a jolt of guilt through his system. Inside, the opulence of Ellen's home never failed to take Mark's breath away. Priceless artworks adorned the walls, and the air was filled with the delicate scent of fresh-cut roses. As Ellen led him to the sunroom, chattering excitedly about her day, Mark found himself hanging on her every word, genuinely interested in what she had to say. They settled onto a plush sofa overlooking the meticulously manicured gardens. Ellen poured them each a glass of champagne, her hands trembling slightly, a detail that didn't escape Mark's notice. "To new beginnings," Ellen said, raising her glass with a twinkle in her eye. As they sipped the bubbly liquid, Mark's mind raced. He had a plan, carefully crafted moves to make Ellen fall for him. But with each passing moment, the lines between his act and reality blurred further. "You know, Mark," Ellen began, her voice taking on a wistful tone, "I never thought I'd feel this way again at my age. When Charles passed away 5 years ago, I thought that part of my life was over." Mark reached out, taking her hand in his. The gesture was meant to be calculated, but he was surprised by the genuine warmth he felt. "Ellen, age is just a number. You have so much life left to live, so much love to give." Tears welled up in Ellen's eyes, and Mark felt a sharp pang in his chest. This wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't supposed to care this much. As the evening wore on, they laughed over dinner, shared stories, and even slow danced in the moonlit garden. Mark found himself opening up about his childhood, sharing truths he'd never told anyone before. Ellen listened with rapt attention, her eyes full of compassion. It was nearing midnight when Ellen walked Mark to the door. She hesitated for a moment before leaning in and kissing him softly on the lips. "Thank you for tonight, Mark. You make me feel alive again." As Mark drove home in a daze, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had succeeded in moving his plan forward, but at what cost? The guilt gnawed at him, made worse by the realization that he was starting to have genuine feelings for Ellen. Back in his dingy apartment, Mark stared at his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. Who was he becoming? A con artist? A lover? Both? The lines were blurring, and he wasn't sure he could distinguish between his act and his true self anymore. Just as he was about to crawl into bed, his phone buzzed with a text from Ellen. "Sleep well, darling. I can't wait to see you again." Mark's fingers hovered over the screen, his rehearsed, charming response ready to go. But instead, he found himself typing, "I miss you already. Sweet dreams, Ellen." As he hit send, a chill ran down his spine. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was still playing a part or speaking from his heart. The chapter ends with Mark lying awake, staring at the ceiling, Ellen's words echoing in his mind. "You make me feel alive again." Little did she know, she was having the same effect on him, and it terrified him to his core. In the quiet of the night, Ellen's earlier words about her health replayed in Mark's mind. There had been something in her tone, a hint of something left unsaid, but he had brushed it off, too caught up in the moment. Now, in the stark silence of his apartment, those words took on a new, ominous meaning. What wasn't Ellen telling him? And more importantly, why did the thought of her hiding something make his chest tighten with fear? The crisp autumn air nipped at Mark's face as he hurried up the marble steps of Ellen's mansion, his mind racing. It had been 2 months since their relationship began, and with each passing day, the web of lies he had woven grew more complex and more suffocating. As he entered the foyer, the usual warmth of Ellen's home felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Ellen's housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, greeted him with a tight smile. "Miss Ellen is in her study, Mr. Mark," she said, her eyes betraying a hint of concern. "She's been in there all morning." Mark nodded, his stomach churning with a mixture of guilt and growing unease. As he approached the study, he heard muffled sobs coming from behind the heavy oak door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. This was his chance. He could turn and leave, end the charade before it went any further. But the thought of Ellen crying alone made his chest ache in a way he couldn't ignore. Taking a deep breath, he knocked softly. "Ellen? It's me, Mark. Can I come in?" There was a moment of silence, then a quiet, "Yes, please come in, darling." The sight that greeted him made his heart sink. Ellen sat at her massive desk, looking small and fragile, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. Scattered across the desk were papers, medical records. Mark realized with a jolt. "Mark," Ellen said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm afraid I haven't been entirely honest with you." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "What is it, Ellen? You can tell me anything." She looked at him, her blue eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "I'm sick, Mark, very sick. The doctors, they don't think I have much time left." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mark felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. What do you mean?" he stammered, his mind reeling. "How long have you known?" Ellen's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "I've known for a while now. I didn't want to burden you with this. You've brought so much joy into my life these past months, Mark. I wanted to hold on to that for as long as I could." Mark's eyes scanned the papers on the desk, chemotherapy schedules, radiation treatments, experimental drug trials. How had he missed this? How had he been so blind? "But why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I could have been there for you, I could have." Ellen cupped his face in her hands, her touch achingly gentle. "Oh, my dear boy, that's exactly why I didn't tell you. I didn't want you to stay out of pity or obligation. I wanted what we have to be real." The irony of her words hit Mark like a physical blow. Here he was, the one living a lie, and yet Ellen had been the one keeping secrets to protect him. The weight of his deception pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. "Ellen, he began, not even sure what he was going to say. How could he confess now? How could he add to her pain? But Ellen shook her head, pressing a finger to his lips. No, Mark, you don't need to say anything. Just hold me, please. And so he did. As the afternoon light faded into evening, Mark held Ellen close, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The guilt of his initial intentions warred with the genuine care, dare he call it love, that had grown in his heart. As Ellen's breathing evened out, exhaustion finally claiming her, Mark made a silent vow. Whatever his original plan had been, it didn't matter anymore. He would be there for Ellen, through whatever came next. He would make the time she had left count. But as he gazed down at her sleeping form, a new fear gripped his heart. Ellen had trusted him with her most vulnerable secret. How would she react if she knew his? The thought of losing her trust, of seeing disappointment and betrayal in those eyes he had grown to adore, was almost unbearable. Mark gently extricated himself from Ellen's embrace and walked to the window, staring out at the manicured gardens now bathed in moonlight. He was in too deep now, emotionally invested in a way he had never anticipated. The lines between his fabricated persona and his true self had blurred beyond recognition. As he turned back to look at Ellen's peaceful face, a realization struck him with crystal clarity. He was no longer pretending to care for her. Somewhere along the way, without him even noticing, the act had become reality. And now, faced with the prospect of losing her, Mark understood the true depth of his feelings. The chapter ends with Mark returning to Ellen's side, gently stroking her hair as tears silently streamed down his face. He was no longer just a young man after an elderly woman's fortune. He was a man falling in love with someone he was destined to lose, and the clock was ticking. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the air as Mark sat beside Ellen's bed, his hand gently clasping hers. The stark white walls and antiseptic smell were a harsh reminder of the reality they now faced. It had been 3 weeks since Ellen's revelation, and her condition had deteriorated rapidly. As Mark watched Ellen's chest rise and fall with each labored breath, he felt a maelstrom of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Guilt, fear, and a love he never expected to feel warred within his heart. The weight of his initial deception pressed down on him, growing heavier with each passing day. Ellen stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Despite her weakened state, a smile spread across her face when she saw Mark. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Of course I am. I'm not going anywhere." Ellen's grip on his hand tightened suddenly, surprising him with its strength. "Mark," she said, her tone serious. "We need to talk." A chill ran down Mark's spine. Had she discovered his secret? Was this the moment when everything would come crashing down? "I know why you first approached me that day at the cafe," Ellen continued, her blue eyes piercing into his soul. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to beg forgiveness, but Ellen shook her head, silencing him. "No, let me finish," she said. "I've lived a long life, Mark. I've seen the best and worst of human nature. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize a young man with ulterior motives?" Tears welled up in Mark's eyes, shame washing over him in waves. "Ellen, I'm so sorry. I never meant to fall in love." Ellen finished for him, a sad smile playing on her lips. "Neither did I, but here we are." Mark stared at her, shocked into silence. She had known all along, and yet she had allowed their relationship to develop. "Why?" As if reading his thoughts, Ellen continued, "I was lonely, Mark, so terribly lonely, and you brought light back into my life. Even if it started as a charade, what grew between us became real. At least it did for me." "It did for me too," Mark choked out, the truth of his words hitting him like a physical blow. "Ellen, I love you. I don't care about the money anymore. I just want." "Shoo," Ellen soothed, reaching up to cup his cheek. "I know, my darling. I know. And that's why I've made a decision." She reached for a folder on her bedside table, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to Mark. "This is my will," she explained. "I'm leaving everything to you, Mark." Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? No, Ellen, I can't." "You can and you will," Ellen said firmly. "But there's a condition." Mark held his breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. What would she ask of him? To confess his schemes to the police? To give the money to charity? Ellen's next words, however, were nothing he could have ever anticipated. "I want you to live, Mark," she said, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Really live. Travel the world. Pursue your dreams. Fall in love again. Promise me you won't waste a single day of the life my money can give you." Mark felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. This woman, whom he had initially targeted for her wealth, was now offering him everything, not just her fortune, but a chance at redemption, at a life filled with purpose and meaning. "But Ellen," he protested weakly, "how can you forgive me so easily? How can you trust me with this?" Ellen's laugh was soft but genuine. "Oh, my dear boy, forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about creating a future. And as for trust, well, I'm trusting you to honor my final wish. Can you do that for me, Mark?" Tears streaming down his face, Mark nodded, unable to speak. He leaned forward, gathering Ellen in his arms as gently as he could, mindful of the tubes and wires surrounding her. "I promise," he whispered into her hair. "I promise I'll make you proud." As they held each other, both acutely aware that their time together was limited, Mark felt a shift within himself. The young man who had walked into that cafe months ago, driven by greed and desperation, was gone. In his place was someone new, someone determined to honor Ellen's legacy, to live a life worthy of her love and forgiveness. The chapter ends with Mark and Ellen planning his future together, a future she wouldn't be part of, but one she was helping to shape. As night fell outside the hospital window, they talked of faraway places Mark would visit, of the good he could do with Ellen's fortune, of the life he would lead. And though the shadow of loss hung heavy over them, there was also a sense of peace. For in this unlikely love story, both Mark and Ellen had found something they never expected, a chance at redemption, and a love that would outlast even death itself. The golden hues of a late autumn sunset bathed Ellen's bedroom in a warm glow as Mark gently adjusted her pillows. The hospital bed, now a permanent fixture in her opulent master suite, seemed out of place among the antique furniture and priceless artwork. Yet it had become the center of their world. "There," Mark said softly, his touch lingering on Ellen's frail shoulder. "Is that more comfortable?" Ellen's smile, though weak, still managed to light up her entire face. "Perfect, darling. You're getting quite good at this nursing business." Mark chuckled, but the sound caught in his throat. The reality of Ellen's rapidly declining health was a constant, crushing weight on his chest. He had thrown himself into caring for her with an intensity that surprised even him. Every moment not spent by her side was dedicated to researching treatments, consulting specialists, and managing her affairs. As he settled into the armchair beside her bed, Ellen reached for his hand. "Mark," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk about what happens after." "No," Mark interrupted, shaking his head vehemently. "We're not having this conversation. Not today. Not ever." Ellen's grip tightened, her blue eyes piercing into his with unexpected strength. "Yes, we are. We can't keep avoiding it." The finality in her tone made Mark's heart clench. He knew she was right, but accepting it felt like a betrayal. As if by refusing to discuss it, he could somehow keep death at bay. "All right," he conceded, his voice thick with emotion. "What do you want to talk about?" Ellen's gaze softened. "I want to know your plans. What you'll do with the money, with your life. I want to be able to picture it, to know you'll be okay." Mark felt tears welling up in his eyes. How could he think about a future without her? The very idea seemed absurd, almost offensive. Yet he knew this was important to Ellen. So he took a deep breath and began to speak. "I thought, maybe I'd go back to school," he said hesitantly. "Finish my degree. Maybe even go for a master's in social work. I want to help kids who grew up like me, you know? Give them the chances I never had. As he spoke, his voice grew stronger, more animated. He told Ellen about his dreams of starting a foundation in her name, of traveling to places they had talked about visiting together. With each word, he painted a picture of a life filled with purpose and meaning, a life that honored her memory. Ellen listened intently, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and unshed tears. When Mark finally fell silent, she cupped his face in her hands. "Oh, my darling boy," she whispered. "You're going to do such wonderful things." The tenderness in her voice broke something inside Mark. He collapsed forward, burying his face in her lap as sobs racked his body. "I don't want to do any of it without you," he choked out. "I love you, Ellen. I love you so much it hurts." Ellen stroked his hair, her own tears falling silently. "I know, my love. I know. But you have to promise me you'll live. Really live. For both of us." As Mark's sobs subsided, he felt a strange calm settle over him. He sat up, wiping his eyes, and looked at Ellen. In that moment, he saw her not as she was now, frail and sick, but as the vibrant, passionate woman he had fallen in love with. And he made a silent vow to keep that version of her alive in his heart forever. "I promise," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I'll make you proud, Ellen, every single day." They spent the rest of the evening talking not about illness or death, but about life. Ellen regaled Mark with stories from her youth, of adventures and loves long past. Mark shared his hopes for the future, his voice growing more confident with each passing hour. As night fell and Ellen drifted off to sleep, Mark remained by her side, their hands intertwined. He marveled at the journey that had brought him here. He had entered Ellen's life as a con man, driven by greed and desperation. Now he was leaving it as a man transformed by love, his heart full of purpose and gratitude. The chapter ends with Mark lost in thought, watching the rise and fall of Ellen's chest. He realizes that the greatest gift Ellen has given him isn't her money. It's the chance to become the man he was always meant to be. As he leans in to place a gentle kiss on her forehead, he whispers a quiet thank you to the universe for bringing this extraordinary woman into his life. But just as Mark begins to feel a sense of peace, a sharp knock at the door jolts him from his reverie. The housekeeper enters, her face pale and worried, holding an envelope. "Mr. Mark," she says hesitantly. "This just arrived for Miss Ellen. It's marked urgent." Mark takes the envelope, his heart racing as he recognizes the return address. It's from Ellen's lawyer. With trembling hands, he opens it, his eyes scanning the contents. As he reads, his face drains of color, and he sinks back into his chair, the letter falling from his grasp. The chapter closes on this cliffhanger, leaving the reader to wonder, what new complication has arisen, and how will it affect Mark and Ellen's fragile world? The early morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of Ellen's study, casting long shadows across the antique Persian rug. Mark sat at the massive mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. The letter that had arrived the previous evening lay open before him, its contents still sending shockwaves through his world. "Alexandra Rothschild," he murmured, reading the name again. Ellen's daughter. A daughter she had never once mentioned in all their time together. The sound of shuffling feet made him look up. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Mark, you've been up all night. Can I bring you some coffee?" Mark nodded gratefully, running a hand through his disheveled hair. As Mrs. Patterson left, he turned back to the letter, his mind racing. According to Ellen's lawyer, Alexandra had been estranged from her mother for over 2 decades. Now, with news of Ellen's illness somehow reaching her, she was seeking reconciliation, and potentially her share of the Rothschild fortune. The implications were staggering. If Alexandra was the rightful heir, what did that mean for the promises Ellen had made to Mark? More importantly, what did it mean for Ellen herself, facing the possibility of reuniting with her long-lost daughter in her final days? A soft knock on the door frame pulled Mark from his thoughts. Ellen stood there, looking frilier than ever in her silk robe, but with a determined glint in her eye. "I thought I might find you here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I see the letter found its way to you." Mark was on his feet in an instant, guiding Ellen to a comfortable armchair. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, unable to keep the hurt from his voice. "All this time, and you never mentioned having a daughter." Ellen's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Mark, it's the greatest regret of my life. Alexandra and we had a falling out many years ago. She disapproved of my lifestyle, my choices after her father died. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. She left, and I was too proud to go after her." Mark knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "But now she wants to see you. Ellen, this could be your chance to make things right." A mix of hope and fear flashed across Ellen's face. "Do you really think so? After all this time?" "I do," Mark said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "And I think you owe it to yourself and to Alexandra to try." Ellen studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes searching his face. "What about you, Mark? What about our plans?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Mark felt a familiar twinge of guilt, remembering his initial motives for pursuing Ellen. But those feelings seemed to belong to another lifetime now. "This isn't about me," he said softly. "It's about you having the chance to reconnect with your daughter. Whatever happens with the will, with the money, none of that matters compared to this." Ellen's eyes welled with fresh tears, but this time, they were accompanied by a smile. "Oh, my darling boy, how did I get so lucky to find you?" Mark leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'm the lucky one, Ellen. Now, what do you say we give Alexandra a call?" The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Mark worked with Ellen's lawyer to arrange a meeting with Alexandra, all while helping Ellen prepare emotionally for the reunion. By late afternoon, everything was set. Alexandra would arrive the following day. As evening fell, Mark found Ellen in her favorite spot in the garden, wrapped in a warm blanket and gazing out at the setting sun. He settled beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked gently. Ellen leaned into him, her voice thoughtful. "I was just thinking about life's strange twists and turns. A few months ago, I was alone, facing the end of my life with nothing but regrets. Now here I am, with a chance to make amends with my daughter and a man I love by my side. It's more than I ever dared hope for." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. "Ellen, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago." But Ellen pressed a finger to his lips, silencing him. "Sure, my love, I know what you're going to say, and it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is who you are now, and the man you've become. That's the Mark I love." Overwhelmed with emotion, Mark pulled Ellen close, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. As darkness fell, Mark helped Ellen back to the house. They spent the evening looking through old photo albums, with Ellen sharing stories of Alexandra's childhood. With each memory, Mark saw a spark reignite in Ellen's eyes, a mixture of hope and trepidation for what the next day might bring. Later that night, as Mark lay in bed, his mind raced with thoughts of the impending reunion. He knew that tomorrow could change everything. Alexandra's arrival might mean the end of his claim to Ellen's fortune. But strangely, that thought didn't bother him as much as he expected. What mattered now was Ellen's happiness and the chance to right a decades-old wrong. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. "This is Alexandra Rothschild. I know who you are and what you've done. We need to talk before I see my mother. Meet me at the Bluefin Cafe at 7 a.m. Come alone." Mark stared at the message, his heart pounding. How much did Alexandra know? And what did this mean for his future with Ellen? As he lay awake, wrestling with his conscience and his fears, Mark realized that tomorrow would be more than just a family reunion. It would be a reckoning, a moment of truth that would determine not just his future, but the legacy of the woman he had come to love more than life itself. The chapter ends with Mark staring at the ceiling, the weight of tomorrow's meeting heavy on his mind. He knows that in just a few short hours, he'll be face to face with Alexandra Rothschild, and that encounter could either be his salvation or his downfall. As the minutes tick by, Mark steels himself for what promises to be the most important confrontation of his life. The early morning mist hung low over the streets of New York as Mark hurried towards the Bluefin Cafe. His heart raced, palms sweaty despite the chill in the air. The weight of Ellen's future and his own pressed down on him with each step. As he pushed open the cafe door, the warm aroma of fresh coffee enveloped him. His eyes scanned the nearly empty room, coming to rest on a solitary figure in the far corner. Alexandra Rothschild. Even from a distance, the family resemblance was striking. The same piercing blue eyes, the proud set of the jaw. But where Ellen's gaze held warmth and wisdom, Alexandra's was cold, calculating. Mark approached the table, his legs feeling like lead. "Alexandra? I'm Mark. I know who you are." She cut him off, her voice sharp. "Sit down." As Mark sank into the chair across from her, Alexandra pushed a manila folder towards him. "Open it," she commanded. With trembling hands, Mark complied. His breath caught in his throat as he saw what was inside, detailed reports of his past cons. Mug shots from a petty theft arrest years ago, bank statements showing suspicious deposits. His entire sordid history laid bare. "How did you?" he began, but Alexandra silenced him with a raised hand. "I have resources," she said simply. "What I want to know is why my mother, of all the wealthy widows in New York, why her?" Mark's mind raced. He could lie, try to charm his way out of this like he had so many times before. But as he looked into Alexandra's eyes, Ellen's eyes, he knew there was only one path forward. "It started as a con," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw a lonely, wealthy woman and I thought I could take advantage of that." Alexandra's eyes flashed with anger, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Mark took a deep breath. "But then I got to know her, really know her. Her kindness, her wit, her incredible spirit. And somewhere along the way I fell in love. Real, honest-to-God love." "Love?" Alexandra scoffed. "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect you to believe anything," Mark replied, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. "But it's the truth. I love your mother, Alexandra, more than I've ever loved anyone in my life. And now I'm terrified of losing her." Something in his tone must have reached Alexandra because her expression softened, just a fraction. "You know she's dying?" Mark nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "I've been taking care of her, every day watching her slip away a little more. It's killing me." For a long moment, Alexandra studied him, her gaze intense. Then, to Mark's surprise, she reached across the table and took his hand. "I believe you," she said softly. "God help me, but I do. I've had people watching the house. I've seen how you are with her. That's not something you can fake." Relief washed over Mark, so powerful it made him dizzy. But Alexandra wasn't finished. "Here's what's going to happen," she continued, her tone businesslike once more. "You're going to tell my mother everything. Your initial intentions, your past, all of it. If she forgives you, if she still wants you in her life, then I won't stand in your way. But if she asks you to leave, you go. No arguments, no attempts to change her mind." "Understood." Mark nodded, his throat too tight to speak. It was a fair deal, more than fair, given what he'd done. But the thought of confessing everything to Ellen, of potentially seeing disgust and betrayal in her eyes, filled him with dread. As they left the cafe, Alexandra turned to him one last time. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice softer than before, "I hope she forgives you. It's been a long time since I've seen my mother truly happy." Mark watched her walk away, his emotions a turbulent mix of fear and hope. As he made his way back to Ellen's mansion, he steeled himself for the conversation ahead. Whatever the outcome, he knew this would be the defining moment of his life. Back at the house, he found Ellen in her study, looking frilier than ever in the morning light. When she saw his face, her smile faded. "Mark, what's wrong?" He took a deep breath, crossing the room to kneel at her feet. "Ellen, my love, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." As he began to speak, pouring out the whole sordid tale from the beginning, he watched Ellen's face carefully. He saw shock, then pain, then something he couldn't quite read. When he finished, the silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Finally, Ellen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this time, it was all a lie?" "No," Mark said vehemently, taking her hands in his. "It started as a lie, yes, but what we have now, what I feel for you, that's more real than anything I've ever known." Ellen's eyes searched his face, brimming with unshed tears. "And the money? Is that still what you want?" Mark shook his head. "I don't care about the money, Ellen. Care about you. Only you. If you want me to leave, I'll go right now and never look back. But if you'll have me, I want to spend whatever time we have left together. No more lies, no more secrets. Just us." For what felt like an eternity, Ellen said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached out and cupped Mark's face in her hands. "Oh, my darling boy," she said softly. "What am I going to do with you?" Before Mark could respond, the study door opened. Alexandra stood there, her eyes moving between her mother and Mark. "Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm home." As mother and daughter embraced for the first time in decades, Mark stepped back, his heart pounding. He had laid everything bare, risked everything for the truth. Now, as he watched the tearful reunion before him, he realized that his fate and his future rested entirely in Ellen's hands. The chapter ends with Mark standing at the window, watching as Ellen and Alexandra talk, their heads close together. He doesn't know what the next hours will bring, whether he'll be welcomed into this reunited family or cast out into the cold. But for the first time in his life, he feels at peace with himself. Whatever happens, he's finally become the man Ellen always believed he could be. The soft glow of sunset filtered through the windows of Ellen's spacious living room, casting long shadows across the assembled group. Mark sat on the edge of an antique armchair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Across from him, Alexandra perched on the sofa, her posture rigid with tension. Between them, Ellen reclined in her favorite chaise lounge, looking frail but determined. The family lawyer, Mr. Goldstein, cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Are we ready to proceed with the reading of the will?" Ellen nodded, her eyes moving between Mark and Alexandra. "Yes, I believe we are." As Mr. Goldstein began to read, Mark felt his heart hammering in his chest. The past week had been a whirlwind of emotions, confessions, reconciliations, and moments of profound connection. Ellen had forgiven him, an act of grace that still left him humbled. Alexandra, while wary, had come to accept his presence in her mother's life. But now, with Ellen's condition rapidly deteriorating, they had gathered for this final, defining moment. "I, Ellen Rothschild," Mr. Goldstein read, his voice steady, "being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath my estate as follows." Mark held his breath, bracing himself for whatever came next. He had told Ellen repeatedly that he didn't care about the money, that her love was all he needed, but he couldn't deny the tiny flicker of hope that still burned within him, not for wealth, but for a chance to honor Ellen's legacy. As Mr. Goldstein continued reading, Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. The will was unlike anything he could have imagined. Ellen had divided her estate into 3 parts. 1/3 would go to Alexandra, along with a heartfelt letter apologizing for the years of estrangement and expressing Ellen's enduring love for her daughter. 1/3 would be used to establish a charitable foundation in Ellen's name, dedicated to supporting underprivileged youth, a cause Mark had spoken passionately about during their time together. And the final third was left to Mark with a condition that took his breath away. To Mark, Mr. Goldstein read, his voice softening, "I leave not just a portion of my wealth, but a challenge. Use this gift to live the life we dreamed of together. Travel the world, help those in need, and most importantly, love without reservation. Your journey from the man you were to the man you've become has been my life's greatest joy. Continue to grow, to love, and to make the world a little brighter wherever you go. Tears streamed down Mark's face as the full weight of Ellen's words sank in. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a mandate to become the best version of himself, to honor the love and trust Ellen had placed in him. As Mr. Goldstein finished reading, a heavy silence fell over the room. Alexandra was the first to break it, her voice thick with emotion. "Mom, I don't know what to say." Ellen reached out, taking her daughter's hand. "You don't have to say anything, my darling. I just hope you can forgive me for all the time we lost." Alexandra nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I already have, Mom. I already have." Then Ellen turned to Mark, her blue eyes filled with a love that took his breath away. "And you, my dearest, do you accept my challenge?" Mark moved to kneel beside her, taking her frail hand in both of his. "Ellen, I don't deserve this. Any of it." "Oh, but you do," Ellen said softly. "You've given me so much more than you know. A second chance at love, at family. Now it's your turn to take that love and spread it to the world." As Mark looked into Ellen's eyes, he felt something shift within him. The last vestiges of the con man he once was fell away, replaced by a sense of purpose and determination he had never known before. "I promise," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'll make you proud, Ellen, every single day." Ellen's smile was radiant, despite her weakened state. "You already have, my love. You already have." The days that followed were a blur of tears and laughter, of shared memories and whispered promises. Ellen's condition declined rapidly, but she was at peace, surrounded by the two people she loved most in the world. On a quiet Tuesday morning, with Mark on one side and Alexandra on the other, Ellen Rothschild took her final breath. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, Mark felt a profound sense of loss, but also an overwhelming gratitude for the love he had found and the life that lay ahead of him. In the months that followed, Mark threw himself into fulfilling Ellen's wishes. He worked alongside Alexandra to establish the Ellen Rothschild Foundation, pouring his energy into creating opportunities for kids who, like him, had started life with the odds stacked against them. He traveled the world, just as he and Ellen had dreamed of doing together. In each new place, he found ways to make a difference, building schools in impoverished areas, funding medical clinics, and always sharing the story of the remarkable woman who had changed his life. And on quiet evenings, wherever he was in the world, Mark would find a moment to look up at the stars and whisper a quiet thank you to Ellen, for her love, her forgiveness, and for showing him that it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. As the years passed, the young con man who had walked into that cafe so long ago became a distant memory. In his place stood a man dedicated to making the world a little brighter, one act of kindness at a time. And though Ellen was gone, her love lived on in every life Mark touched, in every dream he helped fulfill. In the end, Ellen's greatest gift wasn't the money she left behind. It was the love that had transformed a lost young man into someone who could look in the mirror and finally, truly like the person he saw looking back. And that, Mark knew, was worth more than all the riches in the world. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.